We're happy you're back. My tummy is so much happier than it was an hour ago. How about you? Yeah, good. So, thank you for rejoining us after lunch. And so now you're looking at the real Kimberly Peterson, not the fake Lamac Morris. So I'm a veterinarian with Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health, and some of you may be involved in some of our shelter support programs, and so we're the company that provides vaccines for dogs and cats, and also flea and tick control with NexGard and HeartGard and Frontline Gold. And so if you're certainly welcome to reach out to your local sales representative if you're interested in talking about any of those programs. The other thing our company does is provide staff training and facility consultations. And so I put my business card up here if you think your shelter directors would be interested in seeing if there's education or consulting needs. I can certainly connect your facility with the best person to do that. So, this morning, Dr. Morris's presentation was about dealing with infectious diseases in the facility, and we talked a little bit about germs, pathogens, how they behave, what role we play in disease transmission. And so now we're going to be focusing more on the animal side and what can we do to create a population of animals that has improved immunity to fight disease. So what do you think the number one resource that we have to use to help improve animals' immune systems? Vaccines, yay. So here we go. What I hope our objectives will be for the day are for you to feel confident if you have a need to explain the need for shelter-specific vaccination protocols. And that would be as opposed to like vaccinating the general pet population, like from a veterinary hospital. We're going to look at the American Animal Hospital Association and the American Association of Feline Practitioners. We're going to look at the guidelines that they publish for shelters to help us design the most effective vaccination protocols in our facilities. We're going to look just super briefly at how animals respond to vaccinations, through what parts of their immune system are we taking advantage of when we vaccinate animals. And then we pretty much did this morning, so we can just summarize that at the end. Sound good? So we understand, I think, from the feedback I've been hearing from you this morning, that we all have a pretty good handle on why the animals in our shelters have different requirements than the general pet population. So they face challenges that other populations of pets don't see. We talked about the role that we play in controlling the movement of disease around through a population. And now we're going to look at these vaccination protocols that are specific to the risks that our shelter animals face. Remember the slide from this morning that was the stadium full of football fans? So now let's picture that in the animal world. And we know that disease transmission is made much worse when we have a facility that is overcrowded. And so really, what does overcrowding situation create? So we know that that adds to the social and behavioral stresses that animals experience. And then what does it do for our staff? So I think if the animals are feeling stressed, the people that are in the facility also pick up on that. So I think it has a big impact on the effectiveness and the morale of the people that are working with those animals. And then it also taxes our resources pretty seriously if we're trying to deal with those additional stresses. So stresses can come in several different forms. Animals in our shelter populations, we know that they come to us or are living in the facilities with more than one disease. So we may be managing several problems at once, and so those animals' immune systems are very challenged, and they're more likely to get sick when another animal next to them may not be sick, and they're also more likely to shed pathogens in a heavier rate in the environment for other animals to pick up. We know that a lot of animals that come to us are under some pretty significant nutritional disadvantage, and so and sometimes we don't have the animals long enough to get them back to a good nutritional status. So that adds to it. And then the social stresses of animals that wouldn't normally interact with each other if they had the option to avoid each other. And then behavioral stresses if their normal behaviors are inhibited or interrupted. That's all adding to their stress level. So animals that are under stress, what happens to their immune system? So really diminishes their ability to respond as we would expect them to if they were healthy. The facilities that have rapid population turnover are setting up situations where we have animals coming into the facility that may be incubating a disease and not demonstrating that they're sick yet. And so and then we have animals that may be exhibiting signs of illness coming into the facility. Subclinical animals shedding infectious organisms. This is that reservoir population. So these animals may appear healthy, but they're depositing those pathogens in the environment. And then populations that have a lot of turnover don't have a stable, susceptible immunity built up in the population. So this concept of herd immunity is one where if you have 100 animals in a population and 98% of them are protected from a disease, they create barriers of transmission to those two that might be susceptible. So immune animals that have good immunity are putting a stop to the transmission of organisms across the population. So the more animals in the group that have a good immunity to a problem or disease, the more they protect the few individuals that are susceptible. Does that make sense? Okay. We talked this morning a lot about the challenges in maintaining good sanitation practices and trying to stop those 5 methods of disease transmission. And then facilities that have challenges keeping sick animals separate from healthy animals. So how many of you have a facility that has a dedicated isolation area? Okay, good. So what I'm seeing is maybe about half. So we see lots of facilities where there aren't separate rooms, and so this morning we looked at opportunities where we can take advantage of ventilation or the progression of how staff cleans kennels, where we might be able to maintain a healthy population in a ward that also has maybe a sick animal in it. So let's take a look at what these guidelines tell us about vaccinating shelter animals. So the American Animal Hospital Association, I might abbreviate it occasionally as AHA, love that, how that comes out. An American Association of Feline Practitioners, or AAFP. These two organizations convene panels of experts on a periodic basis to review what's going on with infectious diseases in the United States, what types of vaccinations are available, and how, like putting scientific evidence together to build some recommendations to help guide us in our medical decision making. So these aren't meant to be like the only standard of care, but more a guideline to help us answer our questions and solve our own problems in our facilities. So they've done a really good job coming up with some solid scientific evidence, and so it gives us an opportunity to have some power behind our decisions. So when we're looking at vaccination protocols for animals, how do you ever get animals coming into the facility where the relinquishing owner brings a stack of medical history? Yeah. So in theory, if we had a high level of confidence that an animal's vaccination history was intact, there's really no reason to vaccinate the animal on intake, in theory, right? So we'll see shelters that have written in their admissions protocols that, if there's a vaccination history, we might be able to honor that and not vaccinate the animals. So I'm going to try to warn against that because there's so much variability in an animal's immune system, its ability to respond to the vaccination that it got, how the vaccine was handled at the vet clinic. Maybe if they mixed up the vaccine in the morning and then vaccinated the dog after lunch, that vaccine's not active, and so the dog really didn't get immunized from the vaccine that was on its medical record. So I think the suggestion of most of the medical directors and veterinarians that are guiding your vaccination protocols are going to say vaccinate everything on intake, whether it's got medical history or not. Does that fit with what everybody's doing? Yeah. So when we're thinking about making these medical decisions for the pet or for the animals, we want to be thinking in terms of the whole population in the facility and not just in terms of the individual. So if we take the risk and rely on medical records and don't vaccinate an animal on intake, does that leave the population in the clinic, in the shelter, at risk? I think it does, potentially. So it's much better to vaccinate an animal again. Let's say it had a vaccine a month ago. It's much safer to vaccinate the animal again than it is to skip it and put the population at risk. Sound fair? Let's start with rabies vaccines because there's, we'll just get that out of the way. And there's a couple different strategies that we can think about when we're planning for rabies immunization. So first and foremost, we want to follow whatever state or local regulations are guiding rabies immunization. So no vaccine label should take precedent. You know, we're always going to do what the state law requires. Anybody super familiar with what their state requires?
Kentucky is 4 months.
Yeah, good. So very rarely is, you know, are the state laws well understood. So, and if you pull up the state regulations themselves, sometimes they're hard to get through. So this, this website, rabiesaware.org, has done a beautiful job, and they've assembled all the rabies regulations for every state, and they've accumulated it in like a frequently asked question format. It's incredibly easy to navigate. So if you're ever trying to make decisions about whether to vaccinate an animal for rabies or not, then fabulous resources. The other challenge, according to state regulations, is there the right staff in your facility to vaccinate animals for rabies? So that question can also be answered in rabiesaware.org. So just for instance, I pulled up Kentucky on rabiesaware.org, and I just looked at this one piece of information. Who is legally authorized to administer rabies vaccines in Kentucky? So it came up with 1 and 2. 1, a licensed veterinarian. So that means if you want to vaccinate animals in your shelter facility, you have to have access to a veterinarian, which is tough for some of you, right? Number 2, I thought this was so interesting. So for dogs only, no other animals, either the licensed veterinarian or the owner can vaccinate their own dog, but the owner must take a class and obtain a permit. And if they vaccinate any dog that they don't own, then their permit gets revoked. So, yikes. I'm sure you're exactly right. Yeah. So when I was studying for my Kentucky vet license, I don't think I remembered that part of it. So, yes.
So anyone who is not a vet, when they vaccinate, who signs that rabies certificate then? Because that technically is an EVM and an EVM license number.
Right. So.
Yes. Transport across state lines, because where I'm at, we transport, right? So I have to sign all my shelter health certificates. So now I'm wondering, how do you validate that? It's not a veterinarian doing it, and then you ship them out of state. So they've been vaccinated, but a vet didn't sign it.
Is it not valid after being transferred?
So am I understanding the question to mean that if, let's say a vet assistant is vaccinating?
No. Let's just say a welfare worker in general. So someone who's not an LVT or
Okay.
a veterinarian, they vaccinate it.
So are they under the direct supervision of a veterinarian?
No.
I would, well, based on, so I covered that in my Canadian lecture too, but what I'm saying is you have a rabies vaccine that you gave, and you usually get a rabies tag and
Yes.
a certificate that a veterinarian signs.
Yeah.
An LVT can.
Right.
So how do you, if you are not a vet or an LVT and you give this vaccine, how do I know as a vet that you did and I'm going to sign your name?
Then, so see, that doesn't fit with Kentucky's regulations. So, but you know, by the
So
state,
you don't have to have a certificate signed?
You don't get it.
you don't
My
get one
understanding-
unless the
Yeah.
vet gave the shot. right?
My understanding is I could, as a shelter worker, give a shot, a rabies shot, but I will get no certificate, so it doesn't
So like by law then?
It doesn't
And-
count.
So,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
so
That's where I was going.
okay. So if somebody that's not a licensed veterinarian administers a rabies vaccination in Kentucky, that vaccination is not recognized by any, state authority. Does that make sense? Okay.
I'm not sure if they still did the course.
Okay, all right.
I'm sure they don't do the course, because I looked into it, I could not find the course anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, it's probably state.
So, okay. So I pulled this off in like July, so obviously it hasn't been updated. Yes.
I have a question though, but also veterinarian has to have a USDA certification separate to be able to, for the rabies vaccine to count across state lines,
Across state lines, yes.
but within the state. So that's.
It's okay.
So then if owner's giving it, they can't travel with that pet unless
That-
it's signed up.
That's a good question. So her comment is that if this animal is going to cross state lines, then it needs a health certificate from a veterinarian that's got the USDA accreditation. Yeah.
And that health certificate, at least when I sign them, you also have to put a rabies number and a serial number.
Yep.
So then ultimately a veterinarian has to be a rabies certificate.
Yes. So ultimately, if the animal's going to cross state lines, the rabies vaccine should be administered by or under the direct supervision of a veterinarian.
I just want to make sure I have in my head.
Okay, cool.
I've been through it.
It's deep water, isn't it? Yeah. So let's take a look at the kitty cat rabies vaccines first. So American Association of Feline Practitioners, in their guidelines, recommends an inactivated or killed rabies vaccine or a recombinant rabies vaccine given by subcutaneous injection. And I'll back up just a teeny bit and describe these different types of vaccines a little bit. So a killed vaccine is one where the entire organism, or in this case a rabies virus, so the entire rabies virus is used and it's subjected to either heat or gamma radiation to kill it. And then that entire organism is packaged up in the carrier liquid and put in a vial. Okay, so so we're injecting the whole organism in the killed organism in the animal. The recombinant rabies, or the recombinant products in general, or this recombinant rabies vaccine, is one where just one protein, the gene sequence for one protein that stimulates immunity is isolated, and it's only that one protein that's packaged up in the vaccine. So it's not the whole organism, just one little piece that causes immunity. Okay. So that's what those are. So we want to make sure, some of the vaccinations are labeled to give in the muscle, but we want to make sure that we're giving the vaccinations under the skin in case there's a local reaction that we are aware of it. So if we inject in the muscle, we may never see if there's a problem until the animal is a lot sicker than it would be if it was on the surface where we could monitor. So the guidelines are, let's see. Okay, administer one dose of rabies vaccine either on intake or at the time of release, depending how long the cats stay in the facility. So if a facility is adopting out virtually all the cats and they're in the facility for more than a few weeks, then those would be the cats to vaccinate for rabies on intake. That it's a public health issue in addition to an animal health and welfare issue. If you have shelters where the cats are either not all getting adopted or they're there for short periods of time, then those would be the ones where you just vaccinate the cats on release. Does that make sense? Okay. So the age guidelines for rabies are AAFP talks about kittens as less than 16 weeks and adults as over 16 weeks. So the minimum age for a rabies vaccine in a cat and kitten is 12 weeks. So we can vaccinate them if they're 12 weeks or older. They're going to get 1 dose of rabies vaccine, and then if we have them longer, a year later they're going to get another dose of vaccine. And then after that, after the young cat dose, the year-old cat dose, after that they can get a 1 or a 3-year vaccine depending on the what's on the label of the vaccine. So vaccines are either 1-year duration of immunity or 3-year duration of immunity.
I just talked to our vet about that. They said they don't recognize 3-year shots in cats. They don't.
And that may be, that might be state by state, or
Yeah.
that might be,
I just talked to them because I took my elderly cat and then it said, I'm on a 3-year vaccine, rabies vaccine, and they said they do not recognize it in Kentucky.
okay.
No, that's not true. I don't think it is
Well,
true.
if it isn't true, then
I'm a
yeah,
veterinarian.
Yeah.
No, I'm a veterinarian now. He may have had only the recombinant vaccine that's labeled a year.
No, this is killed. This is killed.
Okay. Because
So-
the recombinant's much better for your own cat. The recombinant vaccine is the one that doesn't have an adjuvant and is much safer.
Okay. So,
So that would be to check that rabiesaware.org. At least start there, and
yeah,
then
I just asked, we finally convinced him to do 3-year dog ones. After you had the first and the second, and they'll do it in 3 years now, but he
So-
insisted.
individual veterinarians, design their own vaccination proticals, and so yeah, and some veterinarians, don't, their protocols don't include the 3-year intervals, and are more reliant on the yearly intervals. So I think it just depends on that hospital's protocols, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the vet wants to see the cat every year, but if you're actually holding a rabies clinic and you go through the health department, they require that you give 3-year vaccines at a cost of $5.
3 years, okay.
But it will not be valid for 3 years if it's an animal that's less than a year old.
Correct, yeah.
Sorry.
It's clear as mud.
Anybody less than a year is kind of screwed. It's just weird.
So if the cat is less than a year old, it's going to get a dose of rabies vaccine. A year later, it's going to get a dose of rabies vaccine. And then, depending on the veterinarian's protocol or the label on the vaccine, it can be every year or every 3 years. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so how do we know how old this cat is, this kitten? So can we vaccinate it for rabies or not? So I hope this might help. As a general rule, kittens gain about a pound of body weight per month up until their adult canine teeth come in. So 4 to 5 months of age. That's not, etched in stone, but if you see a kitten that weighs 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds, you can get a guesstimate on how old it is. We can also estimate ages by their teeth. Kittens have a set of teeth that come in after birth, and then they're baby teeth or deciduous teeth, so they fall out when the adult or permanent teeth come in. So let's take a peek and see if we can't establish some kind of rules of thumb to guess how old these kittens are. So for the baby teeth, so the kittens are born with no teeth, and these teeth start to come in, the baby teeth start to come in and are pretty much in place by the time the kittens are a month old. Okay. So that's not really going to help us much on vaccinations. So let's take a look at when these adult teeth come in, because I think that's going to help us. So the adult incisors, or these upper and lower incisor teeth, come in like between 3 and 4 months of age. So if you look at a kitten and it's got just these two central incisors, the adult teeth, then we can estimate that it's closer to 3 months than 4 months. If it's got all its adult upper incisors, it's 4 months old. And so we could vaccinate that one for rabies, right? So if you look at a kitten and it's still got all its baby teeth, it's too young for rabies vaccination. If it's got all its adult upper incisors, you can give it a rabies vaccine. Sound good? These adult canine or fang teeth come in when they're, let's average it out to around 5 months of age. So when we see these adult fang teeth, then we know that they have transitioned from kitten to adult, and that we can stop their kitten vaccination series and now consider them adult cats as far as vaccines go. Okay, so that's another one to remember. We'll look at that again. So might that help everybody? Okay. A little bit more on rabies. These were just some, for some reason my typing didn't hold when I put it up on the screen. A little hard to read there. So these are just some points to remember about rabies vaccines out of the guidelines. We want to make sure, so the AAFP recommends that we vaccinate all cats even if your state doesn't have any requirement. And that makes sense, right? It's definitely a public health issue and also an animal health and welfare issue. If the cat is sick or injured at the time, let's say you're vaccinating for rabies on intake, if it's sick or injured at the time of intake, are we going to vaccinate them? And we're going to say yes. It doesn't mean that that vaccine is going to have the best effect, so the animal might not be able to generate a robust immune response to the vaccination, but we don't want to put the population at risk by skipping the vaccine on an individual. So we're going to go ahead and vaccinate them, and then we're going to revaccinate them when they're healthy. And I want to spend just a second talking about this statement. So there is a process that goes on in the immune system that takes about 2 weeks to complete, like the maturation of the immunity that we're developing. And so within this 2-week period, like after a vaccine or after an illness, the animal is not capable of responding to another vaccine. So there are immune complexes that are undergoing changes within this 2-week window that interfere with immunization. Okay, so is that familiar to some people? Okay, so we don't want to vaccinate animals every week. We want to make sure there's at least 2 weeks between vaccines, and same goes true for an illness. So 2 weeks after the animal has recovered, then we can go ahead and stimulate the immune system again. vaccines are not labeled for use in pregnant queens, but most of the veterinarians that I talk to that are directing vaccination protocols for shelters are including vaccinating pregnant queens in their intake protocols. So for rabies vaccine, it's not an issue at all. It's a killed vaccine, a recombinant vaccine. There's no way it's going to make the queen sick. Where the issue comes in is in our combination vaccines, our core vaccines that are modified live, or so they're living vaccine organisms. And there are instances where one of the panleukopenia vaccine, it's possible that it can cause some congenital brain defects in kittens or in fetuses in the first half of pregnancy in the queens. So here's the issue. Are we thinking about the population? So do we let a pregnant queen into the facility that's not vaccinated and put the population at risk? Or do we take the risk that one of the kittens or two of the kittens might have a congenital defect? So it might not have, but that's the risk that we take. So if you're thinking, if our mission is to protect the population, what's our decision? We're going to vaccinate them when they're pregnant. The other statement in these key points is that it's been well scientifically documented that anesthesia and surgery does not interfere with immunity. So no problem vaccinating the cats that are getting surgery. That feels good, doesn't it? Yeah. Doggies. Okay. Any questions about kitty cats?
Yes.
Yes.
Please.
Okay.
It just came up.
Okay.
What about in the case of little past half, found out she's pregnant?
Okay.
intake. A little past half, and we were declined the opportunity to have her tested or vaccinated any needle stick because it might put her into labor. Is that a best practice? Or is that, we need to say, this is, remember we're a rescue, we need this cat vaccinated.
Yeah.
So now we have a pregnant cat.
Unvaccinated. Oh my gosh.
And we're like, where does she go? What's the
Yeah.
ticking time bomb?
So this situation is a pregnant queen in the last half of pregnancy that the vaccinations were declined by the veterinarian. And so now this cat's in the facility. What on earth are we going to do with her? She's not vaccinated. Yikes.
She has a foster.
Okay.
But we're not comfortable, if there's
Yeah.
another pet in the home, we just, there's
Yeah.
just so many other factors.
So with that variability, there's,
Where do you live? I'll come vaccinate them.
yeah, sneak in the back and vaccinate her. So, I mean, you could put the cat in isolation, right? That's a possibility. Or find an appropriate foster home that might be able to take care of her. Or spay her. Yeah, yeah. That's a challenge, yeah. So we need to bring your veterinarian here, don't
We
we?
hadn't heard of that,
Yeah.
so it was like,
What?
we're not challenging the veterinarian. we're
Right, yeah,
just, okay, this is new, keep this in mind for later, so.
yeah.
okay.
Those are some challenges, there's no doubt about it. So American Animal Hospital Association gives us the dog guidelines for rabies. So we know, again, in dogs also, we have vaccines that are licensed for 1 and 3 year intervals. They're also going to be given by the subcutaneous route, even though some of them may be labeled as intramuscular. Is anybody aware of vaccines being given intramuscular? Okay, cool. And then again, we're going to follow our state or local law. So Tennessee has county by county jurisdiction, I think. Is that right? So It's a little more challenging to figure out what you're supposed to do in Tennessee than it is in Kentucky. So once again, the guidelines help us establish protocols for dogs that are in long-term residence and also in facilities that have a higher turnover. So basically, we're going to vaccinate for rabies on intake if the dogs are in residence for more than a few weeks, or we've got them for a long period of time. American Animal Hospital Association divides us into puppies as less than 18 to 20 weeks and adults as more than 18 weeks. So as long as the puppy is at least 12 weeks old, we're going to give it a dose of vaccine. A year later, it's going to get another dose. And then after that, it can get either 1 or 3-year vaccine. So really similar to the kitty cats, right? If your dogs are in the facility for a short period of time, we're going to vaccinate on release. As long as they're over 12 weeks of age, and the protocol is basically going to be the same. They get vaccinated at release, then the adoptive owners are instructed to get it vaccinated again a year later, and then after that it can go on the 1 or 3-year rotation. Want to look at some puppy teeth? So puppies are just slightly different than kittens in some ways, but not too different. Again, puppies are born with no teeth, but it takes them just a little bit longer to get their full mouthful of puppy teeth. Eruption starts, so they start to get their first teeth in when they're about 3 to 4 weeks old, and those are usually these upper central incisors come in first, and then the next incisors, then the next ones, and then the canine teeth, and then the molars, and it kind of goes from front to back of the mouth is how they come in. So that they have all their puppy teeth when they're close to 2 months of age. And so that might be really helpful if we want to start a vaccine series. We can kind of get an idea about when they might be a month old or when they might be 2 months old. So we're going to start with the incisors and then go out. For the adulti, so to figure out when we can vaccinate for rabies, it's going to be pretty similar to what the cat was. So at about just over 3 months, up to 4 months of age, they're getting, they're getting their they're getting their incisors in. And so when a puppy's about 3 months old, they should have their adult central incisors. When they're 4 months old, they should have all of their adult central incisors. And when they're between 5 and 6 months old, they're going to get their adult canine teeth coming in. So we know that if we have a puppy that's got all its adult incisors, we know we can give that one a rabies vaccine. Any other questions about that? Ready to switch to vaccines that are not rabies. I'm contemplating whether I can go through some disease descriptions. Would that help a little bit? Okay. So the core or the combination vaccines that we want to give to dogs is a combination of several infectious organisms. So we're going to use vaccines that have, like in the same vial, these different infectious agents mixed in. So canine distemper, canine adenovirus and canine parvovirus. So distemper is a really highly contagious, potentially fatal disease that starts off, sometimes we don't recognize it as distemper if it starts off as kind of a mild upper respiratory disease, maybe a low-grade fever, and it can look like the canine infectious respiratory disease complex, like kennel cough. The dogs sometimes can look like they're starting to recover, and then they might break with vomiting and diarrhea. They're a lot sicker at this point in time, and then that might progress into neurologic, like seizures, coma, and death. So it spreads across a susceptible population really rapidly, and high fatality rates. Does anybody have problems with distemper in their kennels? Yeah, no fun at all. Adenovirus comes in two forms. Adenovirus type 1 is canine hepatitis, and that's a highly contagious, acutely fatal. That means the puppies die really suddenly and of liver failure from a virus. The adenovirus type 2 is upper respiratory infection, and then parvovirus is the gastrointestinal infection that causes severe vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, and can progress to death in puppies. So the vaccines for these exist in either modified live virus, which is it's the whole virus, but it's been weakened or attenuated to where it doesn't cause disease. So that happens in the vaccine manufacturing laboratory. So they start with the wild virus that causes infection, and then they transform it or weaken it so that it still stimulates immunity but doesn't make our animals sick. So the preference is to, and then the recombinant vaccines are, in these situations, they act like modified live, so they still work, have the advantages of modified live, but they're only that single gene protein that stimulates immunity. So we're not using the whole organism for immunity. So these vaccines are given, again, by the subcutaneous route. And then depending on the protocol for your kennel cough vaccines, you may or may not include parainfluenza in your combination injection. So here's the protocol. In puppies, which are less than 20 weeks of age, we can start vaccinating puppies as early as 4 weeks of age. And then we're going to vaccinate them every 2 weeks until they're 20 weeks of age. And I'm going to go through why that is in just a second. I don't know why I'm running out of time. It's not good. And then dogs that are over 18 weeks of age, we're going to give 2 boosters, one on intake and then 1 2 weeks later. It is very possible that the first dose of a modified live is going to stimulate all the immunity that you need. So in the pet population, 1 dose of a modified live is expected to produce the immunity that you expect. But in our shelter population, we're going to give the animals the benefit of the doubt. In case they have a poor immune response to the first one, we're going to make sure that they respond by giving them a second one. Does that make sense? The canine infectious respiratory disease complex, CIRD, is also known as kennel cough. And what we're really after in this vaccination is the Bordetella. So that's the primary disease agent in the coughing problems. The AHA guidelines also suggest that we're putting parainfluenza in this vaccine. So if we put these 2 agents together, This is now going to be an intranasal vaccine. So the vaccine contacts the mucosal lining of the nose. There's also an option for an oral formulation. I've got that on the next slide. So the protocol is to give, if the puppies are coming in to the facility, we can vaccinate them with an intranasal or oral, the mucosal vaccine as early as 3 weeks. That's fantastic, right? So if they're between 3 and 6 weeks of age, we need to give them a booster. And they're the only age group that gets a booster of Bordetella. If they're between 6 and 20 weeks or they're adults, at the time of intake, they're going to get 1 dose, so no booster, save you some money, and then they need to be revaccinated every year. Okay. I wanted to bring up this oral option because we know that there are animal control officers or animal care workers that struggle getting intranasal vaccine in the dogs. And so if they struggle, that means they might not do it. So even though the oral vaccine is only Bordetella, it doesn't have the parainfluenza in it, we would rather have that dog get the Bordetella, even if it's oral, because most people can get that done in most dogs. So even though AHA guidelines specifically say Bordetella, parainfluenza, intranasal, don't forget that we have, the human factor to consider in those decisions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think about the injectable Bordetella?
Injectable Bordetella is awesome when it is administered appropriately. The problem is, let me back up here. So the problem with injectable Bordetella is it takes 2 weeks to even start the immune process after the injection, and you don't get really protective immunity until after the booster, 2 weeks after the booster. So you've got a month where we're waiting for this immunity to build when they're not protected. And so that's why American Animal Hospital Association guidelines say use the intranasal, also consider oral, because you're going to start to get protection within 72 hours. So they work really fast. Did that answer? Okay. Before I run out of time, I don't know why I'm chatty today. Kitty cat vaccine guidelines are the herpes virus type 1, which is severe upper respiratory disease, affects the conjunctiva. Sometimes it can cause oral ulcerations, snotty nose, fever, lethargy. These kitties feel lousy. And once they recover, they never get rid of the virus. So every time they get stressed, they're going to shed virus to all the other cats around them. This disease is also sometimes referred to as feline viral rhinotracheitis. So if you're seeing abbreviations on medical records, that's what that is. Colici virus is an upper respiratory disease in kitties that also causes the snotty nose, runny eyes. And this one has those characteristic oral ulcerations that Dr. Spangler showed a picture of this morning. So these kitties feel lousy, their mouth hurts, they don't want to eat, and they also shed virus to their neighbors. Panleukopenia is the really bad one. This is like parvovirus in puppies in a way. It's a relative of that. And it can be acutely fatal and extremely debilitating, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration. It kind of destroys their blood count, and so they have no ability to fight off infection, and they die pretty quickly. it also rampantly spreads across cattery. So who's had problems with panleukopenia in their, yeah, it's pretty nasty. So that's why we want to vaccinate on intake. And so these vaccinations come in a modified live formulation, again, where these are the living virus organisms that are weakened so that they give immunity without causing disease. And they come in either injectable or there's intranasal too. Anybody using intranasal? Kitty cat core? Okay. So I see a few shelters use it, but I think most are using injectable. Again, we want to give it subcutaneous so that we can monitor for reactions. First dose on intake as early as 4 to 6 weeks of age. So that's when those looking at their teeth might help you make sure that they're old enough. We don't really want to vaccinate puppies or kittens when they're less than 4 weeks of age, because the immune complexes that are stimulated by the vaccine can actually damage some of their rapidly growing organs. So in general, it's great to wait if we can. And then on the kittens, we're going to revaccinate the guidelines say every 2 to 3 weeks. The old guidelines were vaccinating out to 16 weeks. The newer ones for both dogs and cats, we want to vaccinate them out another month, so go out to when they're 5 months old so that we can get past their maternal antibodies, so the immune system that they got from their mothers. Feline leukemia, does anybody vaccinate for leukemia in their okay. So the guidelines suggest that if cats are going to be housed in a group, or if they're going to be kept long term, that we go ahead and vaccinate for leukemia. And this would be, they need to be 12 weeks to start their vaccines. Give them a booster 2 to 3 weeks later. Whoops, I'm sorry, 8 weeks. My mistake. Vaccinate them in 8 weeks. Vaccinate them again 2 to 3 weeks later. Vaccinate them a year later. And then it's kind of based on risk assessment. If they're still in the shelter environment, then I would vaccinate them every year. So our primary goals are to establish and sustain the immunity of our population. We're also protecting the individual animal too, right? So, especially we know that from our pet populations that in owned pets, the whole goal is to protect the individual. And in our shelter environments, the goal is to protect the whole population. And then you've heard this a million times now, vaccinate on intake. So what happens if we delay vaccinations by 2 or 3 hours? So we're leaving that animal susceptible to infection before we start immunity. In slides that I didn't get to, we do have some research that shows that if we vaccinate on intake, we have demonstrated that animals start getting immunity within 15 minutes to 4 hours of vaccination. So, and that's under like a distemper outbreak challenge study in puppies. So we vaccinated these puppies with distemper vaccine. They were exposed to distemper, and within 15 minutes so they were vaccinated, 15 minutes later they were exposed, and they did not get sick. That's amazing. Most of the modified live vaccines or the recombinant vaccines are going to behave in that manner. So even though those puppies in that study still got distemper virus in them and they shed distemper virus, they did not get sick and die from it. So it doesn't mean that the vaccines are working well enough to stop infection, but it definitely is protecting them from getting sick and is protecting that population. So vaccines intake so important. So my challenge for you now is to think about your vaccine protocols in your facilities. What are you doing on the weekends or after hours or on holidays about vaccinations? So if we're seeing gaps in getting these animals vaccinated on intake, brainstorm with your group and see if you can solve those kind of problems. So what questions do you have for me? Yeah.
So with the high zoonotic potential and with the fact that you can find it rural, urban, suburban, inner city, where do leptospirosis vaccines fit into
Okay.
the vaccination protocol?
Yes. So in a few more slides that I don't have time for, I don't know what was wrong with all my talking. That's not my normal self. Vaccines that were not included in the ones that we talked about today are, by the guidelines, they're called non-core. So that means we are going to consider bringing back, other vaccines into our programs if the animals are at risk. So in Appalachia, leptospirosis is a huge risk, and so your medical directors may say, okay, we've got to vaccinate these dogs for leptospirosis, and that completely makes sense. You're just going to add that to your protocol. It's kind of like the feline leukemia. If the cats are in the conditions where they're at risk, we're going to add that to the protocol. Does that help? Okay. Anything else? Yes?
I was curious, how many shelters give the feline leukemia vaccination?
I don't know. I don't have a handle on that at this point. Does anybody does anybody vaccinate for leukemia here? 1, 2, 3. So that would kind of be my assumption, is that, how many facilities are set up for long-term care. The animals that are in foster care for long periods of time, I'd definitely vaccinate them. Cool. Thank you so very much for your attention.